But if this parliament is dissolved, the next election will bring more men than it is today.
I have seen people outside saying, oh, parliament must go home. Go home where? We are going nowhere, Mr. Speaker. We are going nowhere. We are going nowhere for sure. Our term ends on 8th of August 2022.
If it is unconstitutional, let everybody pack up and go home. I mean, it can't just be parliament becoming everybody is punching back, you know. Surely it's not right.
All right, good evening. The news gang is here, and that is some of what we are going to be discussing tonight. Maraga's revisit, Parliament's resistance, and LSK's resolve to dissolve it. The length of 2 days in Kenya. Also on the show tonight, Jubilee's no candidate and the DP's independent candidate in Msambweni. Tuko pamoja. The memo cries for the parents of Kenya. Yvonne takes a second look at the love for mothers. Gashuri pulls no punches on changing the constitution. The kicker is on Parliament's self-destruct button, and I'll be angling later on for a new normal. Welcome to the show. The fifth member, or is it the sixth member of this gang, is Yulan Zale. She's going to be our sign language interpreter for the show. And later on, we'll have a guest gangster in the name of Dr. Mutaha Kangu, will be joining us later from Nakuru. He is a constitutional scholar, and we'll be hearing a lot more later on. Ladies and gentlemen, Parliament, that was quite interesting, just looking at those sound bites. Linus, it's almost as if they were sitting somewhere and someone threw a stone and suddenly everybody's running helter-skelter, as we used to say in primary school.
Yes, Joe, I don't want to believe the show of surprise by the Houses of Parliament. And, you know, you would think that David Maraga, Chief Justice, smuggled Article 261 from some banana plantation in Nyamira and suddenly threw it.
And they're all wondering, like, what is this? Where did it come from?
Yes. So the surprise, to me, looks misleading, because these members of Parliament know exactly where they left the debate on the gender issue at, meaning they had not passed the legislation that was required to activate or to enable the two-gender rule to apply. And 261(7) states the consequences. If you don't do this, then the president shall dissolve Parliament. So what did Maraga get wrong? I don't know which part of shall the members of Parliament understand.
And I think that that's a point that needs to be made a lot more, Jamila, that this is an article that exists in the 2010 Constitution. It is an article that is available to anyone, any judge who's listening to something that goes before the courts. It is a remedy that is provided for in the Constitution, that if all else fails, because you can tell actually there's a build-up. If you look at that article, the way it builds up from 5, 6 until it gets to 7, there's almost this reluctance to get to 7. You know, like, let's do this thing before we get to the shall that we've been arguing about all week. So it's very interesting seeing the millions of views that we've seen over the last 2 or so days, as if the CJ actually brought something from another planet or a plantation, as Lina said.
It's true, Joe. We are hearing so many interpretations from those who are supposed to know what to tell us so that we can understand what this exactly means. And since the 2010 Constitution was promulgated, this is the first time that Article 261(7) has been invoked. Remember, when you look at the 5th schedule of the Constitution, there are many other laws that the Parliament is supposed to have passed, and they did. Now, this one is the one that has caused so much reaction, so many emotions. And personally, I don't think either the president or even the CJ thought that we'd get this far, where you'd have to invoke Article 261(7) of the Constitution. And you talk about where it starts from until we get to now, the one that said if Parliament fails to enact legislation in accordance with an order under Clause 6B, the CJ shall advise the president to dissolve Parliament, the president shall dissolve Parliament. And as you said, this is what is in the law. It reminds me of when we were growing up as children. There was that one stick that Mama used to put mahali pale. You'd see it, but uchapwi nayo, but it's there kukushtua that ukisonga line nitakuchapa. I think that's what such articles kama this is there for, that there is a law, there is something that has to be done. If it's not done, there are consequences to it. The same way, for instance, if you break a traffic law, you either pay a fine or unafungwa ama yote mbili. Remember that this, as we said, is in the Constitution. We talk about Article 261. We talk about Article 27 also, which says, at 27.3, which says women and men have the right to equal treatment, including the right to equal opportunities in political, economic, cultural, and social spheres. Article 27.8 says, in addition to the measures contemplated in Clause 6, which is earlier, the state shall take legislative and other measures to implement the principle that no more than 2/3 of the members of elective or appointed bodies shall be of the same gender. And finally, Article 81 says, the electoral system shall comply with the following principles. B says, not more than 2/3 of the members of the elective public bodies shall be of the same gender. Here we mean both male and female. So when I hear members of parliament complaining about it, despite the fact that the bill was brought 5 times and it was not passed, makes me wonder why these issues were not brought out before, and why after they were unable to pass it because of quorum issues or whatever the issues were. That was it. Ziliachiliwa tu, and that's it. Nothing was done after that until now, Maraga's bombshell. So I blame them. Na walaumu hawa bunge kwa kutowajibika kuendelea mbele with what next. They would have found other solutions other than having to go the 261(7) route that was invoked by the Chief Justice. Now we are all left with sasa tufanye nini. There are different interpretations and we're not even sure what next.
And Yvonne, this is 10 years later. I mean, someone would say that Maraga probably would have dissolved the last parliament. I mean, at least the 10th parliament would say, well, they had only between 2010 and 2013. They didn't have the full 5, but, you know, the 11th parliament did. This one has would have taken over from the other, because parliament is parliament, even though the sessions will change and the MPs will change. But it almost looks like this is something that was coming for a long time. There have been suggestions, you know, the court kind of almost just stopping short of saying dissolve, but basically asking Parliament to make sure they pass this thing before it comes to 261(7).
And in fact, that you mentioned that, I do know there are some who have been uncomfortable with the fact that CJ Maraga is doing this now. There are some who say this should have been done right after Justice Mativo's verdict and ruling in 2016, because we're heading right into the 2017 election. But then there was the appeal that was filed by the National Assembly, an appeal they lost, and that verdict came later in 2019. And it just details, you know, like we've done, where we've been with this thing. In 2012, seeking an advisory opinion, you know, what will happen. In 2013, we have an election. 2015, we have the option to pass this. We kick the can down the road in 2016. Justice Mativo actually says, you know, let's do this within 60 days. The attempts to do that. But for me, I think what stands out is now what we're starting to hear from MPs when they say that, in fact, this whole thing is not workable. Which is all well and good. There's been 10 years to start to say this is what we want to do. And I think that's perhaps the most truthful that we've heard from the members of National Assembly. This is not just a matter of what is in the law, it's a matter of whether they actually want to pass it. Because we are not short of formula in this country. There have been several formula that have been put forward. There have been arguments even regarding the cost of implementing this. And there was a report that was done by the IEA, which, you know, quickly put the numbers together and said this is what we would need. We would just need to amend. No, it was to actually top up, nominate the numbers, and it would then be treated like a by-election. They would start to earn from that moment going forward. So all of this formula have been put together, all of these arguments that have been done. I think for me, the crux of the matter is whether this is something we want to do as a nation, including what happens going forward, the shall, the may, and whatever else is being discussed around that. Even if we say get a new parliament, they will still have to contend with finding a formula, which is something we have failed to do from 2010 to date. If we do not get a new parliament and we carry on with this one until 2022, we will still have to contend with this principle that is in the Constitution and find a way to get a formula and, you know, enact a law that implements the gender principle. So I think for me, that is what is at the heart of the matter. Like, you know, right now we're talking about all of these things, the cost of it, is there an IEBC? That's also another argument that I find quite fallacious, that we don't have the money for a new election, but these are the same people who've been pushing a referendum through BBI, which ideally should happen, according to them, between now and 2022. So there is money for a referendum, but there's no money, to elect new members of parliament. It's not a sincere
argument. And there's probably an IEBC for the referendum. I mean,
exactly, there you go.
You see, I look at it slightly differently. Differently in the sense that there's some fundamental questions that are coming up. Which parliament ought to have enacted this law? The 11th parliament. When Justice Mativo, between 29th of March 2017 and 29th of May 2017, gave that 60-day period for parliament to enact this legislation, failure to leads to dissolution of parliament using Article 261(7) of the Constitution. So one of the contestations, and I think from what I saw from Judge Weldon Correal's ruling today, is one of the issues that he didn't probably get into finer details of it, but I could see something closely related to it. One, the term of parliament. Suppose we held an election in 60 days if parliament is dissolved and the president has heeded to Chief Justice David Maraga's instructions. Is there, for example, an assurance that the next parliament that will come will meet the 1/3, 2/3 gender rule? Will it? Then the second question is, on one hand, the Constitution tells you have a right to elect a member of parliament of your choice at the ballot. Right to elect a person of your choice. But at the same time, you must also remember that as you do so, 1/3 of your choices must be of either gender. So those are some of the issues that probably need to be cleared up as Kenyans head to maybe the next election in 2022, or if in the event the president dissolves parliament as advised by the Chief Justice. I don't know whether we will get there or not. I highly doubt we will get there in terms of dissolution. In any case, some of the things that we've seen happening today in court and a flurry of petitions that have been filed today. There was one by Adrian Kamodo. Yeah. Yesterday there was the one by Conchela and Munasar.
Yes.
Parliament is yet to file its own. So you will see a litany of these petitions. And I think the idea is to try and beat the process via a series of petitions. But be it as it may, lastly, if, for example, there will be a BBI process, maybe next year or whichever year, is there a formula that is being proposed that will cure this thing, that in the event that we go to an election in 2022, at least there will be a semblance of a formula that can be applied to achieve the 2/3 gender principle, failure to which there is no guarantee whatsoever that whichever parliament will be elected will be gender compliant.
And I think that would be a good place to go to Dr. Mutaha Kang'u. I hope we have him. He's joining us from Nakuru. And Dr. Kang'u, you have been involved in this process for a long time. You were a member of the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission in Bomas, and this is something you have followed for all of these years. Is this a law that is completely unimplementable and that perhaps we just need to forget it, delete it from the Constitution, or perhaps amend the Constitution so that we can probably get close to the 1/3 that we are talking about?
No, Joe, I wanted to say that whatever the Constitution has required of us to do is something that can be done. We cannot say that Parliament cannot do what the Constitution requires them to do, and that they must amend the Constitution. That is not right. So my starting point would be to say that, number one, we need to ask ourselves, does the Constitution impose an obligation on Parliament? And what kind of obligation is imposed? What does that obligation require Parliament to do? And I will be able to say, yes, the Constitution imposes an obligation on Parliament to make law that can make it possible for us to provide the 1/3 gender for the women. And that obligation does not require the amendment of the Constitution. It is an obligation that has to be done through legislation. And I think what we need to do is to do some very close interpretation of the Constitution. Most of the times, a lot of the people who talk about some of these things have failed to distinguish between reading the Constitution and interpreting and applying the Constitution to the circumstances that we have. So I will try to provide some clarity that is founded on interpretation of the Constitution. And starting with the obligation, the first place we must go is Article 81, which clearly says that no single gender shall have more than 2/3 of elective positions in our country. And then from there, we need to go to Article 100, which then imposes an obligation on Parliament to enact law that provides for representation of marginalized groups, and listing beginning with the women, persons with the disabilities, and so on. And then we need to move from there and go to Article 261, which then refers us to the 5th schedule that sets out the laws that are supposed to be passed by Parliament. And if you go to that schedule, you will find that the law that is supposed to implement Article 100, that one that requires providing for representation of women, is supposed to be passed in 5 years. Those 5 years passed. And at that point, I need to pause and ask, reading those particular provisions, do we think that the Constitution required us to implement this by mere legislation without amending the Constitution? And I think the answer is yes. Parliament was required to make a law, and even the penalty they are facing is a penalty for failure to pass law, not for failure to amend the Constitution. So they were supposed to pass law and provide for this without amendments to the Constitution. And so we need to ask ourselves, what kind of law could they have passed that does not require amendments to the Constitution?
And that's a good question,
and
Dr.
I will
Kambo.
therefore refer people to Article 97, which provides for membership of the National Assembly. And that article says that membership shall have, number one, 290 members, each one of them elected in each of the 290 constituencies as single member constituencies. Number two, there is provision for the 47 women representatives. And number three, there is provision for the 12 nominated members, and the last member of the National Assembly is the Speaker. And so if you interpret 97, you come to the conclusion that if Parliament was required to provide for 1/3 representation of women without amending the Constitution, then they must look at 97, because then that means that they cannot provide for the 1/3 by expanding the membership of the National Assembly. The National Assembly must remain in terms of total number as prescribed by Article 97. So that means that if you look at the 4 subsections of 97, then it turns out that the only way to provide for 1/3 is through the 290 constituencies. And Kenyans will have to accept the reality that we can't give the 1/3 if we are not going to accept the reality that some constituencies at every given elections will have to be women-only constituencies where men will not be allowed to contest.
How, Dr. Kambo, how do you come up with the constituencies that are for women only? Some people will say, well, that is discriminating against the men who might want to contest in those very constituencies.
My suggestion is that, number one, Parliament could have passed a legislation to say that when we are going to elections, we need to create a rotational system so that if we are looking for, if you count the women we already have in the National Assembly, we may be looking for about 60-something, 66 or so more women. And then we say, we therefore must make sure that 66 of the 290 constituencies will be women-only constituencies. And we pass a law that provides for how we will decide which constituency will be a women's-only constituency at every given election. And we must then make a law that avoids making a particular constituency permanently a women's-only constituency, but we say we will have a rotation. And then we divide these seats among all the counties because each county must produce some women. So we will be able to say, if we have, say, the county of Kakamega with a number of counties, we say when elections are coming, when we are going to general elections, we have a provision that says the Electoral Commission shall convene a meeting of political parties so that a lottery is conducted in every county to decide for these elections for 2022 in Kakamega County, which county will be a women's only constituency. Then we move to Kisumu County, we move to Mombasa County, and we determine. And then political parties will be told that in those particular constituencies, you all can only field women candidates. Then we shall be sure to get women elected in those constituencies. But then we must say that we can't make that permanent. So when we go to the elections in 2027, we change again, we do another rotation and remove the one that was there and choose another one.
Dr. Kango, there is one more question here from Linus Kaikai.
Yes, Dr. Kango, what you're describing sounds really, really difficult to implement. If you were to be more practical and address the concerns of critics of this two-thirds gender rule, who say that basically the proposals on how to implement it are impractical. And then number two, the demand is not there. We've not seen demonstrations of people or constituencies demanding that they should be represented by a certain gender, or the gender balance in parliament is not right. We have not seen public demand on that issue. So please address those two.
Linus, let me point out this. Kenyans seem not to have read the Bill of Rights in our constitution. Our constitution does not provide for absolute rights. If you look at Article 24, it recognizes that the rights we are providing for in the Constitution are subject to limitations, and therefore they can be limited. And just a few rights are singled out by Article 25 as the ones that are absolute, which you cannot limit. And if you go to Article 25, you will find that the only 4 rights you cannot limit is the right, the freedom from inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment. Number 2, freedom from slavery and servitude. Number 3, a fair trial. And number 4, the right to an order of habeas corpus. Those are the only rights which the Constitution through Article 25 says you cannot limit them. But all other rights under the Constitution, whether you want to choose a man or a woman, are subject to limitation, and Article 24 makes provision on the conditions that must be met when you want to limit a right. And 24 says a right can only be limited by a law, and only if that law or limitation is reasonable and justifiable in an open and democratic society and meets certain conditions. And so if you look at the conditions set out under Article 24, you will see that a law such as I'm suggesting would pass muster under that provision, because Number one, we are saying we will not make any constituency permanently a women's only constituency. There are women's only constituency for these elections. The next elections, it will be a different constituency. So you are not permanently denying people in that constituency a right to choose someone else. Okay. Number two, 24 says you also balance the objective you want to achieve against the limitation, or the right you are limiting. And in this particular case, the objective we want to achieve by limiting these rights is a very fundamental issue we have decided as Kenyans, that we want women to be represented in parliament.
All right, Dr. Kangu, that's a good place to end it. I'm sorry, that's the time we have, but your point is made, and it's a very interesting point that I'm sure Kenyans will be debating. This a new idea coming to the table of doing rotational representation, getting some women-only constituencies on a rotational basis. A very interesting suggestion there, Gashuri.
In fact, I don't know how applicable that suggestion would be. Actually, it would be seriously contested. I already see various people sending me texts telling me it is not possible.
Well, in fact, I guess someone would say which one is possible, because in 10 years we haven't moved. This is my thought.
This is my thought. What if in the upcoming BBI process, maybe, for example, there's a suggestion, one, to do away with the woman representative positions, and instead, let's say, have each county elect 2 senators, a man and a woman. Therein, you resolve the 50-50 question almost in parliament, and maybe in the Senate, that is, and maybe suggest that there are 6 nomination slots to represent minority, youth, and persons with disabilities. Gives it about 100, 50-50 or thereabout. And then in the National Assembly, remain with the 290 constituencies, the 12 nomination slots that can be easily divided 6-6 to achieve that parity, and then have a top-up list from political parties that in the event the composition of the National Assembly does not meet the threshold, the 1/3, 2/3 threshold, then that list can be used as a top-up the same way it is applied in the county assembly. That is one way I would think would be applicable and would resolve these issues.
And I think many people, we need to take a break, but many people also talk about the numbers in parliament that are already probably too many. Linus,
I just wanted to point out where the debate stands right now. In Article 261, we have 9 sub-articles. Right now, where the country is Article 7, sub-article 7, which is if Parliament fails to enact legislation in accordance with an order, the Chief Justice shall advise the President to dissolve Parliament, and the President shall dissolve Parliament. But typical Kenyans, we are doing a receipt which has not been ordered by the CJ. I don't think the CJ has asked the country to discuss a formula of implementing the
But you see why that is going to happen, Linus, is because the President is not given any timelines to dissolve Parliament. Yeah. So one would say, well, within that time, whatever it is, if Parliament can still pass something, and then someone will say, well, now the President has not dissolved, but Parliament has passed a formula. Who knows?
Well, because this debate now shifts from the law to politics, which is a shift probably we'll make after the break.
Right, and as we take a break, here's my line. Listen, all this is kizungu mingi, or which formula, or do we rotate everything? Is this an issue of compliance? Is it an issue of convenience? We've heard arguments against the affordability and the law and a working formula. We've tried so many over the last 10 years. The crux of the matter here is whether this is something we want to do, not just in Parliament or as a nation. This is a cultural issue. This is a societal issue. This goes for me beyond...
Did we pass it by mistake? Because we voted.
There were interests.
There was a lot of interest at this point, and it was putting in this there to make this quarter happy and to make that camp happy. For me, the idea is
maybe
if we want to, because let me tell you, let's be honest.
How late that admission is coming.
Yes, no, but even the MPs are saying it today, though.
Can we then do a second referendum? Like they're saying, okay, let's do this again.
I actually think that's what it is, because if we wanted to, it's 10 years later, would have done this a long time ago. We have implemented so many other laws, enacted them to implement the Constitution. This boils down to whether we want to or not, period, in my view.
Okay, a friend of mine was telling me that that article was put there more as a threat. No one ever imagined that we'll get to a point where we can actually talk of dissolving Parliament. But Newsgang takes a break. We'll be right back with a lot more, including something happening or not at the Jubilee headquarters.